Dragon Called, a slow-burn, sexy paranormal romance. Written by Cara Lockhart and Cassie Alexander. Read for you by Victoria May. Chapter 1. While waiting for the bus, Andi Ngo, Andi, had plenty of time to consider that answering an overnight help-wanted ad online may not have been the world's best idea. But it wasn't like her student loans were going to pay themselves. She was already working nights at the county hospital, and then there was the whole thing with her idiot brother's bail. Danny had gotten into stupid situations before, but she never thought he'd run out on her, miss his court date, and leave her stuck with a $10,000 bail bond. So, what was another shift, or two? Who needed sleep anyhow? Sleep was definitely overrated. She took a pair of thick black plastic-framed glasses out of her coat pocket and put them on. She had perfect vision, but she knew from experience glasses on Asian girls made people think she was either super smart or super sheltered, both of which had worked in her favor before. The bus came, picked her up, and deposited her as far as it would go across town, at the bus stop outside the Briars Country Club. Its ominously thorned, wrought iron gate made her glad she knew when her last tetanus shot was. She pulled out her phone to text the mysterious number that said she'd gotten the job in the first place. "I'm here," she texted. 5 minutes early, no less. She took off her glasses, which turned out to be quite dirty from underuse, and fogged them with her breath to wipe them down. She'd never been this close to the BCC before. There was never any point when she was most definitely not, nor would ever be, a member. But working at her glasses stopped her from staring at her phone. The person who'd given her the number when she'd gotten the job had claimed to be Damian Blackwood's secretary. Andi found that hard to believe. What on earth would Damian Blackwood need a private nurse for one night for? Or, perhaps the better question, for whom? She'd talked to an ambulance transport nurse once who'd gotten paid for an entire day to follow around a Saudi prince and his rig. So she might be getting paid just to watch someone breathe, barring an assassination attempt, which sounded lucrative and exciting. But she'd never get to tell anyone about it, not even her roommate Sammy, because they'd made her sign a non-disclosure agreement. And then the text that had told her when to be here had made it clear that this assignment was no questions asked. Which would be hard because questions were like her thing. Had to be, because secrets could kill you. Asking questions saved lives. Andi ran an aggressive thumbnail over the glasses' left lens, trying to scrape off a streak, and found a scratch too deep to ignore. She should have tried these on at home and brought one of her other half-dozen pairs. She sighed and pocketed them, returning to her phone to check the time. And now they, whoever they were late. Maybe this was all just an elaborate hoax. She crossed her arms in the dark, turning her back on the gates and the mansions behind them. She hated thinking like that because she knew the slightly paranoid anxiety that made her an excellent nurse was a double-edged sword when it came to life coping skills. But it had stopped her from getting into the Subaru STI that Danny'd borrowed from a friend the last time she'd seen him, which stopped her from getting her prints in his freshly stolen car. Andi checked the time again, then jumped as the heavy gates behind her began to fold in on themselves, thorns disappearing like at the end of Sleeping Beauty. An all-black car, in a make she didn't recognize, pulled up. But she realized it was for her as it parked, and a driver in a suit emerged. He was breathtaking. A Caucasian man with black hair, strong nose and chin, full lips, and piercing light brown eyes that appeared almost golden. The crisp black suit made him look sharp, but he didn't need it, which led to thinking about what he might look like without it, which was not appropriate right now, but Andi couldn't help herself. He was injuriously handsome, the kind of hot you'd do a double take for and wind up getting hit by an oncoming bus you hadn't noticed, and hot enough that there was no way he didn't know it. She more than knew his type, and she steeled herself to give him no response. "Miss Ngo," he asked as he opened the passenger door for her. He actually pronounced her last name right, which was also sexy as hell. Just Andi, she corrected him, getting into the back seat and scooting over. He took a moment to stare at her, and she felt a low-hipped thump of desire, which she concealed with a tight smile. Of course, he agreed, giving her a slight nod and a much warmer smile as he closed her door. He took the driver's seat again and looped the black car around to pull back behind the gates of the Briars like a tide. She had no idea what kind of car she was in, but she had a feeling that Danny would lust for it. The interior leather felt buttery, and the drive was certainly a lot smoother than a city bus. Too bad the whole having a driver thing made her uncomfortable. Admittedly, she couldn't drive, so she really did need one, but her last boyfriend hadn't even opened her door for her on their first date, and Josh had definitely not looked like that. Andi, girl, you need to have fun and get out more. She could hear Yumi gently chastising her in her head, and right after that, her roommate Sammy adding, "And you need to get laid." She was willing to admit that both those things might be true, but nothing like that would happen tonight. "So, we are going to Blackwood's estate?" she asked the driver, trying to make innocent conversation as the car rose in the hills. She glanced up at the rear view, waiting for him to respond, and realized the defiant blue streak in her black hair was showing. Shit. She hadn't gotten into nurse mode yet, but it was time. Her hands reached up and wound her hair into a practiced bun that hid the color. "We are indeed," said the driver, not taking his eyes off the road. "Do you know who I'll be taking care of?" This made him look back at her in the rear view, brow lifted in bemusement. "Someone who needs your help, clearly." Andi groaned on the inside. "That's a little vague." "Would you prefer to hear that I'm not at liberty to say?" His tone was clearly teasing. "No, not really." Andi rolled her eyes. Once again, hot did not equal charming. "So, what's he like?" "Who?" the driver asked, overly oblivious. "You know who, come on," she said, leaning forward in the car to talk to him between the front seats. "Damian." She'd Googled him, obviously, but that hadn't told her much. The Blackwoods were old money, rode over on the Mayflower style, stocks, yachts, islands, but it seemed like no one had taken a picture of the man since he turned 30, 20 years ago. "And what makes you think he'd be involved with the hiring of temporary staff?" the driver asked, twisting to smirk back at her. So much for blue-collar solidarity. Andi sank back into her seat and loosened her scarf. "Right. So, is there anything you can tell me about this gig? Or do you just do as he says? No questions asked," she said, in a tone of voice that mocked the text she'd gotten. "Asking too many questions of the Blackwoods is generally a bad policy," he said, in a cautionary tone. "Or of anyone, really." "Too bad that's like half my job," Andi muttered beneath her breath, then more loudly said, "No questions, huh? Sounds like a great person to work for." The car took a swooping right turn. "Just do what you're told, and you'll be fine." "Yes, of course," she clipped. Good help didn't gossip, and that was all she'd be. She wasn't getting paid to be curious. The driver swung left without turning on his turn signal, and she swayed with the car. The road rose as it curved, zigging and zagging up the side of a hill. She twisted to look behind her and caught a view of the city below, all lit up like a rippled sheet of gold. It was so unexpectedly beautiful, she gasped. And then it felt like she'd been stabbed. In her chest, right below her heart. She pressed a hand beneath her breast, trying to figure out what was wrong with her and if she should confide it to this strange man. But then the pain was combined with the strange impression that she should run back down to the city lights below, where she knew that she'd be safe. From what, though? As prickling terror rushed over her entire body like ice-cold water. "Are you all right?" the driver asked, glancing back at her in the rear view, his voice serious for the first time since she'd met him. "Yes," she said defiantly, even though she still felt like she was being stabbed by fear itself. Her heart was hammering so fast, like the time she'd been chased by the cops because of her dumb brother or the time she'd been mugged. But she'd never felt such an intense urge to run, run, run. Why? She double-blinked and forced herself to breathe, looking out the window at the city's golden streetlight tapestry. It swept out like wings to encompass the hills on both sides, and from somewhere in the depths of her childhood memories, her Auntie Kim's voice burbled up. "There are dragons in this world, Miss Ngo." There was a note of concern in the driver's voice that hadn't been there earlier. Why on earth did she think about Grand Auntie Kim? It had been years since she'd seen the old woman who had taken care of her as a child during the summer, who'd told her and Danny stories of dragons after their dad had walked out on them and their mother had had to work. Andi inhaled deeply and shook her head. "Whatever this is, you are bigger than it. You have handled worse. You're going to be fine." "Or," said a darker part of her mind, "you're having a heart attack at a freakishly young age, and in about 3 seconds you should ask Mr. Handsome here to call 911. "Andi," the driver pressed. "Do you know CPR?" Andi asked, half joking, half not. Then the sense of terror lifted, just as fast as it had come on. "Oh my God," she whispered to herself, sinking back into the car's luxury leather interior. "Okay, never mind. I'm fine, honest." His eyes narrowed at her in the rear view. A flash of anger? That was on him, not her. "Don't worry," he growled, suddenly a much darker man. "You're allowed to be here." What an odd turn of phrase. She would have asked him why he'd said it quite like that, but she was too happy to not feel like she was dying anymore. The car swung around again, and the pavement turned to cobblestones as they pulled through a final gate. The driver slowed and parked in the roundabout, right in front of the mansion's huge church-like doors, and she quickly got out to breathe fresh air before he could come around and release her. She leaned against the car and looked up. Compared to any place Andi'd ever lived or ever seen, the house was utterly ridiculous. It wasn't a house so much as a castle, and it had the kind of turrets that you expected to see archers peeking out from, although in this day and age, and with Blackwood-level money, machine guns seemed more apt. Stained glass windows dotted the upper floors, some glowing with light, while ivy grew aggressively up the lower ones, crawling out of a garden that could best be described as feral. A huge circular fountain behind her had a dragon head on top of it, shooting out water instead of smoke. The driver walked around her and opened the front door, and light beamed from somewhere inside as he gestured for her. "Ready?" Andi forced a lightness she didn't feel into her voice and expression, plastering on a smile so sweet it was giving her cavities. "As I'll ever be." Swallowing for strength, she walked behind him indoors. They were together in a vast entryway that had 3 sets of stairs, wide ones arching toward the right and left wings of the house, and an odd spiral staircase that shot straight up. Her eyes followed it to a circular door in the ceiling, 2 floors up. A belfry? Some kind of service hatch? Her guesses were interrupted by the driver reaching for her, and she stepped back quickly without thinking. I didn't catch your name." "It doesn't matter," he said. She stared at his open hand and then looked to him. The corners of his lips were turned upward, teasing her, and it felt like her heart stopped beating for a moment. Damn it. Was he taunting or flirting with her? Was he so hot he just assumed he'd get his way? Or was he so used to hanging out with rich people he thought he was one, just like when clerks were rude to you for no reason in fancy stores? He cleared his throat and lifted his hand slightly. "Would you like me to take your coat, or do you prefer to wear it while nursing?" She had a sudden urge to meet him late at night in a pool hall and see how much she could take him for, but she took off her coat and handed it over. "You're assuming I'll get the job." He shrugged. "I'm assuming you're competent, but I've been wrong before." "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Mr. It Doesn't Matter," she said. Why wouldn't he give her his name? Her roommate Sammy was convinced that answering an overnight help wanted ad online was Andi's beginning of a true-life crime show on Investigation Discovery. And maybe she was right. Maybe Mr. No-Name was a felon or something. Something he'd have in common with Danny if she couldn't talk her Uncle Lee into getting her brother an expensive lawyer. She squinted at the driver. His reluctance to tell her his name only made her want to know more. He resisted her dig. "And your phone?" he asked. She handed it over, much more reluctantly. "You did sign an NDA," he reminded her as he put it in his pocket. "But what if there is an emergency?" "We'll give you a spare." A spare phone wasn't the same thing as her phone, but she tried to shake it off. He glanced at his watch, and his expression became serious. "If you'll follow me," he said, and then started walking without looking back to make sure she did so. She almost had to trot after him. He was so much taller than she was, at least 6'3" to her 5'0", and he was apparently in a hurry. Then again, maybe she was relieving someone else, another hired hand who needed to leave quickly. At least chasing after him let her see his ass. His suit was particularly well cut around him, not leaving much to the imagination. Not when your imagination was as good as hers. He surprised her by stopping and turning around, as though he'd known she was looking. She stopped too, like they were playing a game of red light, green light. "Coming?" he asked, waving her up. "I'm trying to, sheesh," she said, striding forward, almost out of breath. "Come a little faster, then," he encouraged her. His eyes narrowed briefly, and she knew he knew exactly what he'd said to her as he turned back around. She wasn't sure if she should be irritated or ever so slightly pleased. Her brain said the first, while her body said the latter. "Shut up, body." Andi always ended up falling for the broken, temperamental types. There was something alluring about trying to fix things and people. But she knew better now, after several exes, and tried to get all of that out at work, where people actually did need fixing. They practically raced through a living room, appointed with a mix of plush couches in old and modern styles, statuary of all kinds, 2 fireplaces on either end big enough to roast a bear in, and vases filled with flowers almost halfway to the cavernous ceiling. Past that was a dining room with a table elaborately set, too many chandeliers to count, and a long hall with many locked doors. She could tell they were locked because they were bolted from the outside, some with more than one bolt, and the locks were exaggerated, even comical, like they were meant for the outside of pirate chests. She couldn't help herself. She stopped in front of the last locked door and inhaled, a question on her lips. "Mm-hmm," he said with a closed mouth, mockingly as if she were a naughty child. Then he had the nerve to turn and wink at her. "No questions, remember?" Andi's jaw clenched. She was so going to find out his name. But he started walking again without waiting for her, until they reached a final door. "You're late," said a voice from inside the room. Damian himself? She straightened her shoulders and walked in. No, the man who'd spoken was far too young to be Damian. While Mr. No-Name was so attractive as to almost be otherworldly, this new man was the pride of the Midwest, a golden boy through and through. Hair the color of rust, lightly tanned skin, and a build that said he could pick a girl or several up. "Sorry, someone didn't open the gates." Mr. No-Name's voice was almost acidic, and Andi realized that this is who he'd been mad at in the car, not her. But why? All the gates she'd seen had opened. It didn't really matter, though, because just past the homecoming king, Andi could finally see why she'd been brought here. She could tell the room had once been a library, even though the shelves were mostly clear, and the only thing remaining to hint at its prior function were leather couches pushed to the side and the scent of old books. Now, though, the place where the couches had surely been was occupied by a man in a hospital bed, surrounded by the accoutrements of the sick and infirm. Oxygen tanks, monitors, IV pumps on IV poles, a chest tube, a feeding pump spinning like a spindle, and, impossibly out of place for her nursing experience thus far, a small Siamese cat lay curled at the end of the bed. I was a little busy, the other man defended himself, gesturing at the bedridden man. Apparently, no one was concerned about the cat. Mr. No-Name opened his mouth to say something, and Andi cut him off. Well, I'm here now. She walked up to the bed, blinking in the dim light. She thought she recognized him from grainy newspaper photos. Is this Mr. Blackwood? It looked like him, a little. Mr. No-Name came to stand beside her. It doesn't matter who he is. Can you keep him alive for 8 hours? She tilted her head to look up at him. Maybe, if you tell me what's wrong with him first. What she could see of him was covered in splotchy bruises. There was an oxygen mask on his face, and Andi belatedly realized his tightly restrained arms were both insanely muscled and covered in tattoos. Definitely not Mr. Blackwood, then. Unless Mr. Blackwood was even more interesting than she'd assumed. He fell down the stairs, said Mr. Midwest entirely unconvincingly. Andi looked over at him to ask for more information and caught him looking over her at Mr. No-Name, his face full of concern. He's starting to wake up. I don't want the first face he sees to be a stranger. Grimmelkin's here, Mr. No-Name said, with a pointed look at the cat, and then he jerked his head toward the door. I need you out with me tonight. You know why. He held up a wrist and tapped on a watch that probably cost as much as the car he'd driven her in. Drivers definitely didn't make that kind of money. Mr. No-Name driver with a fancy watch. Andi stopped herself from making a discomforted sound. She already knew from painful personal experience that rich people played weird games, and if it was more likely she'd get this job by pretending to be dumb, fine. It was only for one night, after all. The sooner she started working, the sooner she could make Danny's bail, and then maybe all this would make sense. An emphasis on the maybe. Look, can somebody here just give me a report? The man she was replacing dragged his gaze away from Mr. No-Name and started talking to her. At her, really. She pulled out a pen and paper and wrote everything down, asking appropriate questions at appropriate times, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being partially shouted at, and definitely judged. When he was through, she held up a hand. 3 things. Go, he allowed her. The cat? She couldn't help but ask. The driver answered her. He's practically a family member. Presence non-negotiable. Next. Okay, then. Weird-ass rich people. Andi shrugged and looked back at the patient. So why is he here? Why not a hospital? In the city? Mr. Midwest was incredulous. Yeah, why not? There are good hospitals there. Hospitals aren't safe, Mr. Midwest stated, like that was a known fact. Andi bit her lips hard to not say anything about his bizarre opinions. All right, then, she went on. 3rd is, who are you? Medically, I mean. His name's Austin. He used to be a paramedic, Mr. No-Name said for the man. And in the Marines, Austin added. She stuck her hand out so Austin would have to shake it. I'm Andi. Ah, an Andi, not Andy, Austin said, with slightly different emphasis, giving Mr. No-Name a glare. It's not my fault your assumptions were sexist, Mr. No-Name said, a slight grin flickering at the corner of his mouth. He looked meaningfully at his watch again, and Austin disappeared down a hall. So, 8 hours, Mr. No-Name asked her. From Austin's report, this patient mostly sounded like a wait and see. He was injured and unconscious, but there was no real reason he hadn't woken up yet, other than possible brain damage, which, yeah, made this whole level of secrecy perhaps understandable. If you were the head of a household worth a fortune and someone got injured on your watch, you might need to keep their issues under wraps. She glanced at the patient's vitals on the monitor, the level of urine in the Foley, and the slowly draining chest tube. She could keep almost anyone alive for 8 hours, at the hospital. But what would happen here if things went poorly? This situation was bizarre, and even though they were paying her a ton, she still had her license to think of. She glanced up and found Mr. No-Name watching her shamelessly. So shamelessly, she flushed. Austin reappeared, pushing a crash cart before she could stutter out any words. You know what to do with this? Of course. The presence of a crash cart allayed only some of her fears. But I'm not a doctor. If he needs a doctor, just call me and I'll get one. My number's pre-programmed. Mr. No-Name handed her a phone as Austin went on. And who should I ask for? She asked, trying not to sound curious in the least. Mr. No-Name let out a snort as if to say, nice try. I'll know it's you. Austin interrupted. There's more oxygen tanks against the wall. Just keep him comfortable until we get back. Andi looked between them. None of this made sense. Not the cat, not this job, not this house, and definitely not these two extremely handsome yet extremely odd men. Where are you going anyhow? Mr. No-Name shook his head at her question. Out, but we'll return by dawn, and I promise you'll be on the first bus back to the city, okay? Mr. No-Name's gaze pressed her as Austin loomed. She inhaled, to tell them how insane all this was and back out, but then she reminded herself that the only thing that needed to make sense was the fact that one night here would equal a month of her normal paycheck. She glanced at the patient and did her best to ping out with her inherent nurse radar, honed by months of taking too many shifts, taking in his color and the numbers on the screen. He was the most normal thing here, hands down. Yeah, okay, she said, deciding. She pulled out the phone she'd been given and waved it at Mr. No-Name. I'll call if anything happens, otherwise I'll see you in 8. Good, Mr. No-Name said and smiled at her, fully, for the first time all night. The sensation of his pleased attention on her was almost as bad as whatever had happened to her on the road here. She wanted to run away, but she found she couldn't. She was struck, pierced, like she was a deer in headlights. He was just too much. Then the cat leapt off the bed and wound around Mr. No-Name's legs. He glanced down, and the moment was over. The spotlight had moved on. She sagged, caught herself, and hoped he hadn't seen it. It didn't seem like he had as he knelt down to knuckle the cat's head softly. The cat meowed at him, repeatedly, as if it had strong opinions, and Mr. No-Name gave it a dour look. No, she didn't bring anything for you, he told the cat, and then looked back at her. If you hear any sounds in the house, just ignore them. It's an old house. It creaks a lot. Austin coughed from the door, and Mr. No-Name headed toward him. Her audience was over. The men left, and the cat followed them. Andi relaxed, then became embarrassed by how she'd felt. What was she, some kind of schoolgirl? You know better. Whoever she'd been in the moment he looked at her, stupidly happy, foolishly hopeful, and just a teensy bit terrified, it wasn't the real her. The real Andi was a nurse who knew what to do, every time, all of the time. She went to the bed, unlooped her stethoscope from her neck, and started to assess her patient. Chapter 2. What did Grim say? Austin asked Damian on their way to the garage. That she's too small to be of any use. In reality, Grimmelkin had asked if Andi had brought him any cheese. The bluer, the better, because the house was out. Luckily, Damian was the only one who could understand the hugely powerful multidimensional guardian he'd been assigned at birth, so no one else knew how easily a gift of cheese would distract him. For once, the cat and I agree. If my brother wakes up, I know, Damian said, shutting down further conversation. If Zach woke up while they were gone, a big if, then hopefully he and the nurse could have an intelligent conversation, after which she'd take off his restraints. He'd be confused about what had happened, but he'd be smart enough to realize she was an outsider. He got into the armored SUV, waiting with some of the rest of his crew. It was just him and the guys tonight. Max was driving, Jameson had his eyes on his electronics, and he sat close to Austin, who was busy wiping down the barrel of something black and shiny. He sank back into his seat, thinking about the nurse. She smelled good, his dragon commented. Shush, he told his dragon. But it was right. Oil, plastics, but more overwhelmingly, the aroma of iron surrounded him. Humans had so much iron in their blood, it was a wonder to him that they weren't magnetic. Living in human society, he had gotten used to the metallic scent, but for some reason, tonight it seemed more pungent than usual. It was all because of her. When she had gotten into the car, the gaseous stink of the bus she had been on and the medicinal chemical scents that were a hallmark of her occupation clung to her coat. Those were expected. But underlying all that was her own subtle scent, undetectable to most humans, and yet abruptly mouth-watering all the same. Apples and caramel. Yes, that's what it reminded him of. And salt water. How strange. He swiped through his emails, opening the unread files Mills had sent over. Top of her class in community college and then nursing school. But she'd suffered student loans, a staggeringly high amount of debt owed to a hospital which looked like medical bills for a relative before it got wiped, presumably by that relative's death, and a brother who apparently couldn't resist taking rides in cop cars, which made her perfect for his purposes. Hungry enough to be looking for cash, smart enough to keep Zach alive, and hopefully smart enough to not ask many more questions. There was always the forgetting fire if she got too curious. He reached the end of her background check and found she lived in a gentrifying part of town, in an apartment above a Greek bakery. That explained her scent. Her apartment probably smelled entirely of baked goods. Mystery solved, Damian put the phone back into his pocket. But his mind went right back to her. Andi. What an odd name for a girl. He had the strangest urge to say it out loud, irrationally, to see if the sound tasted as good as she smelled. And that interesting streak of blue that he'd glimpsed a flash of before she'd wound her dark hair up. Something about the act of her hiding it made him want to unwind and expose it again, to possibly feel the wrap of it around his hand. "Why'd you warn her about the house?" Austin asked Damian, distracting him from his thoughts. "Because Grimalkin doesn't like strangers." "He doesn't like anyone," Austin countered. "He's keeping an eye on Zach, isn't he?" Max said from the driver's seat, defending Damian's guardian's integrity. Damian knew his cat and his old weapons master got along. They had to. They were the only two things that had come from the realms with him, albeit at different times. The battle armor Max had on made the whiteness of his skin around it even more shocking, and Damian knew if he had his hat off, all his hair would be ghostly pale. He'd had an albino's pale eyes, too, before he'd lost them in a fight with another bear shifter. Mills had replaced them with something magical hidden by goggles, turning him into the perfect bearer of Damian's forgetting fire, since its powers no longer seemed to work on him. And whatever kind of eyes he had now, he could snipe an unearthly creature down at 800 yards. "Grimalkin's probably hoping that he'll die," Austin said darkly. Max broke into a toothy grin. "Nah, if Grimalkin wanted either of you dead, you'd be dead already, puppy." Austin snorted at him. "Better to be a wolf who's a fighter than a bear who's a chimney sweep," Austin muttered, before addressing Damian again. "Was she sensitive enough for the perimeter to bother her?" "Definitely." Austin grunted. "How'd she do?" "Admirably, considering she didn't know she was being magically attacked." There were several concentric security rings around his mansion, some magical, some not. He'd both seen and tasted her panic as they'd driven over one of them, the one Austin had been supposed to turn off. He'd seen other men throw themselves out of moving cars in fear and not know why, to crawl crying back downhill. While she'd been scared, Andi hadn't run. Another interesting point. "Do you think she bought it?" Austin asked, pretending to put a driver's hat on. Damian knew he meant the subterfuge of him pretending to be a driver in his own employ. He'd wanted to meet the person taking care of Zach, to get a feel for her. He hadn't expected for him to wind up being so intrigued. "It doesn't matter," he answered. "Either she doesn't figure it out, fine, or she does, and the fire will make her forget. Why bother? No one would believe her. She'd just be another internet crackpot," Jameson said while staring intently at the computer on his lap, as immersed in it as Austin was his weapons. He was very dark-skinned and lean in opposition to Max's bright whiteness and Austin's bulk, and between the hardware on his lap and the hardware of his arm that they'd replaced with tech, the man was practically half computer. "You mean, like you?" Austin said, goading the younger man. "Don't make me change your Netflix password," Jameson snarked, then waved his hand for silence. "We're approaching the source of the signal. Slow down, Max." Max grunted an acknowledgement. He was driving what Damian called the tour bus. It was a heavily armored SUV, fortified with metal shielding, bulletproof glass, blast-resistant undercarriage, and, more importantly, personally warded by the most powerful witch on this side of the Pacific. Damian knew where they were by scent. The saltwater, gas, and oil fumes could only be from the familiar miasma of the docks, and they were here because somewhere nearby there was an unearthly creature they needed to kill. A few days ago, a gate had opened in Damian's domain. Gates were random rifts or tears between this world and other realms, occurring when and where Earth and other realms overlapped, allowing unearthly things through for as long as the passage remained open. They could be as small as an atom, leaking a slow trickle of matter through that didn't belong, making exposed, non-magical humans think they saw Bigfoot, UFOs, or ghosts. Or they could burst open like lanced boils, letting creatures that ought not be through, flying, crawling, or oozing out to wreak havoc on whomever was unlucky enough to encounter them. Damian and his crew's job was to kill the monsters, seal the gates, and wipe the minds of any human left alive. They'd easily closed the most recent gate 50 miles outside of town, but not before 3 sizable creatures had made it through. The one they decided was the most dangerous, that needed to be put down instantly, had been an insectoid creature the size of a bus with bulletproof chitin and webbing that had been tougher to cut than steel cables. It had been impervious to fire, too, at least human fire, which was why Damian had had to let himself go. They'd corralled the monster in a low canyon, but it had slithered up a wall and over the defensive line Damian had created for the men, cutting him off from them. Zach abandoned his post, ran to help, and gotten grabbed. He'd screamed, and Damian could still hear those screams, agonized and terrified now. And Damian had changed in an instant, from the human that he pretended to be to the dragon that he was. Massive, mindless, monstrous, angry. His dragon ended the creature in moments, reveling in the freedom and destruction, flipping the thing over to claw through its underbelly. Afterward, Damian had struggled to regain control. It hadn't been easy. "How much farther?" asked Max through gritted teeth. Damian could feel the preparatory intensity of his crew as they waited quietly for Jameson's next instruction. Between Zach's injury and losing Michael last year, just because they were good at what they did didn't mean it was safe. "Almost there. We've got to pass it to triangulate it. Just keep going," Jameson said, oblivious to everything but the data he was harvesting on his screen. Damian had told Jameson and Mills to prioritize creating technology to predict when gates were opening, so they could preemptively seal them before the unearthly came through. They were gaining ground, but until they managed to perfect it, members of his team would always be in danger. And so would Damian, because every time he shifted, his dragon came closer to claiming and keeping control. "Stop," Jameson said, closing his metal hand into a fist. The vehicle downshifted, and the men hurried to finish arming themselves as Damian thought of everything he'd given up to get this far, everything he'd put his men through, all the unearthly they'd faced, losing Michael, and now nearly losing Zach. "Whoa," said Austin, looking at him askance, and Damian realized he was exhaling smoke. "Let's keep it together this time, 'kay?" Damian narrowed his eyes at him. "Zach almost died." "I know," said Austin with a dispassionate look on his face. "He's my brother, but that doesn't change things." Damian held his gaze, fighting the urge to let his eyes flare with magic. The very same thing that gave him purpose, which made him a member of this team, was also the very thing that put them all at risk. his own unearthly heritage. Of all of them, Austin was the one who never forgot what Damian was. And when he finally turned, becoming draconic without hope of turning back, Damian knew without a doubt that Austin would be the one to put him down. "Which one's here tonight?" Max twisted around to look back now that they were parked. "The lady or the tiger?" They'd all seen the other two creatures they'd passed over in favor of killing the bus bug thing. "Hang on." Jameson's magical equipment wasn't anywhere near as sensitive as Damian was at this range. He closed his eyes and reached out with his senses. The all-too-familiar red magic bloomed in his mind, shaping itself into a vision of the source. He felt the fiery warmth that all creatures from the unearthly side had, and more. Longing, desire, and urges that made his heart beat faster and his heat sink low. "The lady," said Damian. Everyone groaned. It wasn't that they couldn't take down a succubus. They were pretty frequent unearthly escapees. It was just the after effects that made things difficult. "It had to be a fucking succubus," said Max with a groan. "They're creepy as hell once you get down to the real monster underneath." "Agreed," Austin said, then turned to Damian. "What's this one look like?" He concentrated on the spark again. "In the other realm, it has white wings along with the tentacles," he said finally. "Here it's got big breasts and blonde hair, a cross between a Christmas angel and a porn star." Austin cursed, but reached for the net gun before stepping out. They were indeed, as Damian had predicted, on the docks, which was a strange place for a succubus to be working, unless there was some sort of pleasure cruise, an emphasis on pleasure, nearby. But Max had his goggles on, scanning nearby buildings. "Over there," he said and pointed. Once he had, Damian could feel it too, without any technological or magical enhancements. Somewhere in one of these buildings was a bass-heavy beat. An illegal warehouse party at the docks attracting a succubus? Sounded about right. "Spheres, Jameson. Catch." The other man reached into a belt holster and retrieved marble-sized magical objects to toss to each of them. Damian caught his and felt a layer of magic envelop him as they walked down the alley. It wasn't there to protect him so much as to protect other people from him and the crew. No one wanted to see their group of overly muscled and beweaponed men walking down the street, so the sphere showed them whatever they wanted to see instead. Men without guns, puppies, lost balloons. Damian didn't question the sphere's judgment, he just knew that they worked. "The only thing is," Austin began as they got closer to the sound, "we'll still need a victim to lure it away," Damian said, finishing his statement. He unholstered his gun to hand it over to Jameson. "How come only you get to talk to the pretty ladies?" Jameson teased. "Because I'm immune to their charms, and if this one is as bad as it feels, it has very nasty knives." He handed his sphere over too, leaving the safety of its magic behind. The others were all in tactical gear, but he'd kept on the suit he'd worn to pick up Andi. He didn't need gear when there was a 60-foot fire-breathing reptile inside him, longing to get out and fuck shit up. Max cracked the knuckles on one hand. "Where do you want us?" Damian scanned the building. Two huge men were bouncing in front of a door that was practically vibrating with the bass from the building behind it. The building itself only had small windows up at the top, strobing red and gold with the lights from inside, which meant external visibility was shit, but he had a feeling he'd be able to lure the thing out. "Southeast exits best," Jameson said, looking at schematics on a tablet. "The other buildings there form a natural cage." "Done," Max said, jogging to the warehouse's far side. Jameson saluted Damian with his metallic arm and ran off in the other direction, which left him and Austin alone. "Try not to have too much fun before the hurdy bits," Austin said with a smirk, then went to head around back. Damian counted to 20 to give them all time, then headed toward the door with his most wicked smile. Getting in was the easy part. $100 bill did that. But he stood out once inside, very different from all the riotous dancers. He was GQ, and they were all sweaty, high, and half-dressed, a wild throng of humanity. More like prey, grumbled the creature inside him. He ignored it and made sure the southeast exit was feasible. It was at the end of a hallway and not blocked by pallets or locked with chains. Southeast is a go. Going silent now, he replied, taking out his earpiece before walking toward a makeshift bar created out of pallets and storage boxes. He didn't blame the succubus for coming here. He would have liked to have done so himself as a human, to just be able to let everything go, and to know that everything would still be safe and okay. He didn't have that liberty. Damian closed his eyes, pulsing the powers inside him out to search for her like a radar. Once, twice, 3 times, and the beast would feel him. But it didn't matter. He had her, in the middle of the dance floor. A group of men and women circled her, thinking they were enjoying themselves. He knew if he let his gaze go draconic, he'd see her true form, wings tucked back as her waist-high tendrils spun out to spike everyone nearby. Everyone she speared would think they were in love, with her, with here, with life. It wouldn't matter. And if she wasn't stopped, she'd drain them of energy until they became her mindless slaves. He ordered a shot of whiskey and downed it at the bar before heading to the dance floor. This wasn't the place to sip. If he was going to get her to follow him outside, he needed to seem fully human, and every human here was drinking. The group of people around her had grown from 5 to 10. He needed to act quickly, but he hesitated intentionally, like he was unsure, and made sure to catch her eye on a spin. She had hair like the sun, and it swirled around her like her tendrils would have if he'd allowed himself to see them. He stood at the edge of the dance floor, looking rich and cruel and disapproving, not taking his eyes off of her, daring her to come to him. She was like a cobra dancing with a snake charmer, doing everything in her power to lure him closer into tendril range, but that wouldn't do. He needed her alone, so he watched her studiously, letting her know he was interested, but not content to be amongst the commoners. One by one, dancers seemed to come out of their reverie and stumble to the edges of the dance floor as she released them, not knowing how close they'd come to losing their lives. He had to fight not to smile. This wasn't his first time with the succubus. They were all alike, completely certain in their abilities to torment humans, and completely unable to ignore a challenge. She was close now, still dancing, but just for him. She was wearing next to nothing, the thigh-high slits of her skirt showing off her legs as she moved, as she kept moving hypnotically, coming closer. He could smell the addictively sexy pheromone she emitted, and almost wished it worked on him, because it was hard to stay still knowing that once she came a few steps closer, she would strike. She smiled winningly, and the first tendril hit, straight through his heart. The dragon half of him bellowed and rose and fought, and he had to wall it off as quickly as he could. Calm down, now. He did his best impersonation of a struck human for her. You, he whispered, his voice low. You're different. Her voice was a purr with an inhuman thrum underneath. She struck another tendril through him, and instead of screaming, he had to pretend to be enamored. I want you. In real life, he would never be that abrupt, but bewitched humans had no common sense. That's good, she purred. I want you too. She reached her hand up and touched his face. I'll tell you a secret. I want everyone here. He smiled at her, pretending to be innocent, trying to ignore the way he could feel the spears of her magic slide in and out of him, sucking at his essence. Her hand trailed down his chest and seemed certain to go lower. Me first, he offered. Kill her, the dragon in him growled. Shut up, he commanded. Oh, yes, you first. she agreed, letting her hand sink to his waistband. He reached for her and dragged her close, kissing her hard before she could feel that he wasn't, that he was the only thing not turned on by her within 30 feet. "I need you," he said, coming up for air like a desperate man. The things she was doing to his brain and inside of him. A migraine blossomed, and it was hard to stay clear-headed, and his dragon howled. "Outside." She smiled at him, and with his dragon this close, it looked like all her teeth were fangs. "Yes," she agreed, and together they stumbled toward the southeast exit. Damian wasn't sure what shape his crew's attack would take as he made out with the creature down the hallway toward the southeast door. He ignored the pain, trying to concentrate on the feel of its breasts against him and not letting it lock him in against a wall. Then they reached the door, and he shoved her outside, blocking the door with his own body. He didn't want the succubus running back into the crowd as they shot her with warded guns. No one would get hurt, but the chaos they'd cause could create a stampede. Every single thing they fought with was warded, right down to the bullets, which meant they wouldn't hurt normal humans, just unearthly things. Like him. Which also meant he was in harm's way. "Move!" Austin shouted at him. The succubus took in her surroundings, the blinding phosphorescent lamps his crew had set up, the guns that were trained on her. "What?" Her voice rose with an unholy pitch. "No, I did not escape the depths of—" A sniped shot, Max, from a nearby building Damian knew, came through her neck, blowing out her throat. He could almost hear the bear shifter saying, "Don't care," as he silenced her. Damian threw her forward with all his might, felt the tendrils releasing for a second as they moved with her, and then they grabbed on harder. He sank to his knees as she drained his strength, and with wide eyes, he watched her heal. Unearthly things were stronger than earthly ones, yes, but they didn't heal like that. Maybe Max had only grazed her? But then why was his shirt streaked with so much blood? His thoughts took only half a second, and then he heard Jameson call his name. "Damian, catch!" Jameson was throwing his weapon to him, and the succubus batted it down with a now visible wing. It didn't matter, though. Austin was advancing, pumping rounds into her, and Max was still sniping her from afar, and slowly the human shell of what she appeared to be was blasted away until only the monster of what she was shone underneath the phosphorescent lights. Their weapons pushed her back out of striking range, and then Damian was free. She sank to her knees, her tendrils writhing desperately around her, searching for fresh victims. "No," she whispered as she realized she was dying. An iridescent purple eye swung in an overlarge socket to spot him. "You and I, we are the same. I felt it in you. Why do you align yourself with them when you could have flown with me?" Damian didn't have an answer for her. He just stood and picked up his gun. This needed to be over. He squeezed off a round into her head as the tendrils that had pierced him snaked weakly by his ankles. "I will crawl into you and eat your soul," she threatened from a mouth that spontaneously appeared on her neck as Jameson brought a lamp closer. "Pity for you. I don't have one," Damian said, and fired the shot that finally ended her.